Hi everyone, my name is Sebastian Savjansky. I'm the Assistant Religious Education Coordinator at Marston College, Randwick. Welcome to the Judaism Holocaust Theology Masterclass for Sydney Catholic Schools. The slides and the recording are going to be available on the link where you found this class, so you can always come back to it. And if you have any questions, feel free to just type them into the chat and I'll get to them as soon as I realize they're there, hopefully as soon as possible. All right. We may as well get started. So our overview for today's lesson is that we're just going to have an introduction to the syllabus, the learning intentions, our success criteria, defining what Holocaust theology is, just sort of fleshing it out, the contributions of Holocaust theology to Judaism, and then our impact. So we'll have a look at that a bit more as we look at our syllabus. And we'll look at a sample response, and hopefully then as we go through, we'll possibly link it or integrate it to the other units that you might be studying in your Judaism depth study. Okay, so pardon me. So we have here the outcomes for Judaism. You're able to explain aspects of religion. Sorry, 1 second. You're able to explain the aspects of religion and belief system, describe and analyze the influence of religion and belief systems on individuals and society, describe and analyze how aspects of the religious traditions are expressed by their adherents, and evaluate the influences of religious traditions in the life of adherents. And from there we go looking at our organization application and responses to questions as we keep going through all our outcomes. What we really want to look at are the necessary terminology that is going to be asked specifically in this section that we can see comes in the HSC syllabus, and that's describe, explain, analyze, and evaluate. So we see in these questions a lot of the time, describing at our basic level in our section 2, we might get an explain, maybe an analyze, but we often get evaluate the significance, or explain the significance, describe the significance, which sort of leads itself into an evaluative response. We'll have a look at that as we go on. We might just move on here. Give me 1 second. So the focus of the Judaism depth study is the contribution of significant peoples, ideas, practices, ethical teachings to an understanding of Judaism as a living religious tradition. You see that we've bolded living religious tradition because we always have to look at the contemporary aspect of the religion and how that's being lived out. It's very important that we're consistent in that, looking at that. We're looking at something historical specifically with Holocaust theology, but it is a living, it's a living, evolving paradigm of the religion. Even to this day, people are coming up with different responses to the original responses of Holocaust theology. And we'll see that as we go into our impacts. All right, pardon me. So in our learn about, we're looking at the significant school of thought of Holocaust theology. It's very important that we're not confused here. Often I've noticed at times people who find this unit challenging might look at a theologian and say, well, that's the significant person I'm going to study. Holocaust theology, as we get to our definition, you'll see, is really the amalgamation of several ideologies, philosophies, theologies that have come together in the wake of the Holocaust. We'll have a deeper dive into that in a second. And after we've learned about those contributions, we need to explain them. So that explain language, as you can see up there, is cause and effect, providing our examples of various contributions or contributors of Holocaust theology, demonstrating how they arose as a result of the Holocaust. We need to then analyze the impacts of various contributions to Judaism of Holocaust theology. So demonstrate with examples how the various ideologies of Holocaust theology contributed to changes within Judaism. So how did those ideas then sprout into something more? Students need to understand how these teachings contribute to Judaism as a living religious tradition. So we're just at this bottom section now. So you're showing the relationships between contemporary Judaism and the contributions that were made in Holocaust theology. What's really important in this section is that you're looking at the variance, you're looking at how different Jewish groups may have responded to those ideas, or to even the event of the Holocaust, which is often a good way to show your marker a breadth of understanding. I feel that students often go very deep into a response without looking at the broader idea of the different variants. And then are we able to evaluate how the various contributions influence the life of adherents? So really form that dynamic living religion, that changing religion. Okay, so learning intention is to describe the various contributions of Holocaust theology by post-Holocaust thinkers and theologians and explain their impacts on Judaism, demonstrating Judaism as a living tradition, as I was just saying. So by the end of this, I hope that you can do these 5 things. We can define the concept of Holocaust theology, which hopefully you can do in the next 5 minutes. Then you can name and outline at least 3 prevailing ideas that have arisen from Holocaust theology. Now, it's really important to understand that there is a variety. There's a variety of ideas that occur and arise from the Holocaust. Today, we're going to be looking at 3 ideas that were quite big when they were first spoken about, and some may have changed, some may have influenced other ideas, and we'll look at that as we go into our impacts. Right? You can link to sacred texts to demonstrate how these are based on traditional teachings, and you can use quotes from authority from various rabbis, which we'll also have a look at. Can you identify contemporary examples where Judaism has been impacted as a result of Holocaust theology? So what has changed, or how do they remember this event? And you can feel confident in responding appropriately to questions posed by the HSC regarding Holocaust theology. And we'll have a look at a section 2, a longer answer from section 2, an 8 marker from a previous HSC. But we'll get into that as we move on. So let's just have a look at our definition. So our introductory statement, if we were to define Holocaust theology, is just that it's the body of work of multiple people that have, pardon me, that have experienced the Shoah or the Holocaust. This word Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust, which we will, I'll give you the definition a little further down the track in our next slide, I think. But all these ideas attempt to really come to terms with all their previous ideas about God as a result of the Jewish people's experiences in the Holocaust. We'll have a little bit of a look at the context of that in our next slide. It's really important that we understand that this was a rich understanding of God over a number of centuries and millennia that had sort of evolved to what it was, and then they had this massive earth-shaking, world-shattering event. And so if we add detail to our introductory statement of the definition, we sort of go further and we say Holocaust theology attempts to deal with notions of free will, survival and identity, and ultimately God and the covenant. So already, before we've said anything else, we're already bringing in principal beliefs. So I hope you all remember your preliminary study of Judaism. Our principal beliefs are vitally important, as are other aspects of our preliminary study as we keep going through. And I hope you'll see that there's a link in that all the way through. So this covenant in the face of a world-shattering experience of the Holocaust. Then we will illustrate briefly with our examples here. And I've got 3 ideas. These are the 3 big notions that occurred post-Holocaust. The notions such as the death of God, the 614th mitzvot. Once again, I hope you remember there were 613 mitzvot or commandments in the Jewish law that we had this new 614th mitzvot come out of the Holocaust, and we'll have a look at that soon. And Hester Panim, which is the notion is God hiding his face, and looked at the Shoah from different perspectives, demonstrating the breadth of Judaism as a dynamic living religion. All right, let's move on. So when we talk about dynamic and living, it's important to remember that we're thinking about those big questions. You know, how do religions answer those big questions that change from age to age? And that but specifically now, we're looking at the big questions as a result of this big event of the Holocaust. Some Jewish adherents, such as Ignaz Maybaum, called the Shoah the third Hurban, which the word Hurban in itself means Holocaust, but they use it specifically, as you can see in this green box here, referring to the destruction of the temples. So in 587 BCE and 70 CE, the temples in Jerusalem were sacked, first just previous to the Babylonian exile and then by the Romans. And these two temples were the center of Jewish life. Now, the Holocaust has been described, as we see here, by some people as that third moment where Judaism demographically changed, had a complete shift. In 587, they split. There were two basically strands of Judaism going based on their teachings, based on the Talmuds that were written because of the exile that happened in Israel. Then in 70 CE saw that start of the diaspora and the movement out of Jerusalem into Central Europe, into Spain, into all those areas. And so you had this giant shift in demography. And then finally, post World War II, we once again see that. So that's where we have that link. Arguments about the nature of God ask questions as like, why would God allow this? And this is a question that us as people, if anyone believes in some sort of supreme being, supernatural being, if you remember your very first unit in Nature of Religion, would ask, they can ask that question of God. Why would you allow this? Or some ideologies call for people to look at human free will in asking why did this happen, rather than looking at God. Okay, let's move on. So let's have a brief look at context. Before World War II, Europe had a Jewish population of about 9.5 million living throughout Europe. The Sephardi Jewish population resided in Southern Europe and the Ashkenazi in the Central and Eastern Europe. Sorry, I've got a mistake there that I missed. The vast majority of this population lived in Eastern Europe, but by the end of World War II and the Shoah, over 6 million Jewish lives had been taken. You see that's a massive chunk of their whole population. This led to a vast array of physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual effects on the Jewish population. Many survivors feel the need to bear witness to the events and experiences, and some have done this through sharing their own experiences. This is exemplified in the Sydney Jewish Museum. So there we have our first example. There we have our first example of a change already. A group that is specifically linking to the Holocaust to make known what happened and their experiences as a Jewish person. Others instead contributed through the insights they gleaned about God. So the ideas that were built around God as a result of this event. Remember, we called it either this third destruction of the temple or a world-shattering event. And Professor Yehuda Bauer in 1998 wrote in Jewish Identity After the Holocaust, for some people, the Holocaust is a call to return to Orthodox religious observance. For others, it's a call to integrate with the non-Jewish world to avoid such things from happening in the future. And so you can see there already in this quote, a very didactic approach to faith, that some were saying we need to move more into our insular Orthodox style, whereas others were saying, no, we need to open up to be more ingrained in society so people understand us. We have this completely contradicting ideology from the same religious group. So just in brief, our contributions here, we've got the ones that we're going to look at today in a bit more fleshed out fashion are Richard Rubenstein, who put forward this notion of God is dead, or the death of God. And we'll have a look at the repercussions as a result of that. Eliezer Berkovitz, who spoke about the hidden face of God and man's free will, which we spoke about earlier, this idea of, sorry, my pen keeps going off, I might just not use it. This idea of Hester Panim. And then Emil Fakenheim, who really advocated for the survival of the Jewish people through the 614th Commandment. And we'll have a big look at that soon. But what we need to remember is that Judaism, over the course of all these thousands of years, through the Shema, that principal belief in the monotheistic nature of a God that's omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, was challenged. This belief of a God that's always good was really challenged by the idea of this event being allowed to happen. And so we're going to have a look at how these challenges were met, how they were cast, and how these challenges themselves were then challenged again. Okay, so Richard Rubinstein, our first contribution, God is dead, is what was his theory. And this came, you can see we've got a Time magazine article in '66. Rubinstein was a Reformed Jewish professor, and he released a book after Auschwitz claiming that logically, as a logical being, God could not exist after an event like the Holocaust. So humans could not think logically that he exists. As a result of his assertions, he argued that as a human, the only way you could react to that is say, I can't follow God anymore. And this was important to know. It's important to know that this changed over time, right? But because of this, Rubinstein stated that humans didn't really have a divine purpose, and there was no God that revealed himself to mankind, and ultimately that God does not care about humankind. So that idea, if you remember your history of the patriarchs, that God was slowly revealing himself to the patriarchs little by little until he made that covenant with starting with Abraham and moving into Moses, that this was not really something that was applicable to people anymore. While his work was closely followed early on, it was rejected because I think we can all agree it's a pretty nihilistic view to take on this idea. Even if you are starting to sort of lean that way in your belief systems, you can see that this structure it doesn't really lend itself to religion at all. Rubinstein sort of claimed that the traditional concepts of Judaism needed to be challenged. Okay, so those traditional concepts really, if I can I will take my pen and see if it works. Yep, it does. Okay, so traditional concepts such as maybe, and we'll have a look at this briefly, the covenant. So the covenant, or the principal belief that, you have to follow the covenant, the halakha, so the way that they were called to live, the oral tradition of Judaism was really challenged, asserting that people needed to find a new purpose if they weren't God's chosen people. Because if the covenant doesn't exist, how are you God's chosen people? And as we move on, his declaration that the people of Israel's God of tradition was dead actually created a new theology that prized, demythologized, or sort of took away the mythology of the religious tradition of Judaism, and where Jewish solidarity, or the idea of Judaism, became more of a human agency. It became human agency, we can say, became cultural rather than religious. And ultimately, Rubinstein asserted that the covenant was no longer relevant, which is our big takeaway here, to the Jewish people. He pushed for the idea of a neo-paganism, or like this new sort of communal structure of Jewish people, that they needed to be in the world for themselves rather than, for the religious aspects. They were a Jewish people in name rather than in spirit. We've got a quote here about all these different ideologies and the idea that the European Jewry cannot be likened to the testing of Job. So the idea that, before, suffering had some sort of purpose. If we remember, the book of Job in the Tanakh looks at a man suffering, but suffering for God's sake. And now suddenly Rubinstein is saying that that's no longer something that I'll just highlight that Jewish people can link to because of this amazing suffering. While Rubinstein was no longer a believer in a God that interacts in the world of mankind, it's important to note this green box at the bottom, he did still believe in a God who created a world and then let it go on its own path. So he was like, yes, there was a God, God was there, but then suddenly either he stopped interacting with the world or he's just left. Okay, so that's our first contribution. We then move on to the idea of Hester Panim and Eliezer Berkovitz, who put this forward. So Hester Panim itself is an idea taken from Deuteronomy 31:17, which says, I will become very angry at them on that day, and I will abandon them and hide my face from them. And that notion of Hester Panim, or that reading of Deuteronomy, has been turned into this idea of Hester Panim, which is, this hidden face. God has a face that he hides from reality, but it's not just, God hiding himself. There is a purpose to that. And so Berkovitz, a modern Orthodox Jewish rabbi, so now we're looking at modern Orthodoxy as opposed to Rubinstein, who was a Reform Jewish adherent, rejected that God was at fault for the events of the Holocaust. What he said was that it was necessary for man to carry out his free will, good or evil, because then God can see that, so then humanity can see that God is benevolent, because he gives us the choice. Whether we choose to do good or evil is then man's choice. And he stated that the absence during the Holocaust of God was due to the classical Jewish concept of Hester Panim, which we just spoke about, drawn from the Torah and Deuteronomy, meaning the hidden face of God. If God were to reveal himself and hold back the hands of tyrants, Berkovitz said, man's free will would be non-existent, thus rendering them, basically, he had this idea that if God had done that, we would be no better than robots, or, and God would just control us. So humanity needed to experience this. And as you can see in that second last point, this meant that for God to love and care for humanity, he needed to hide his face and let people carry out their will despite that massive evil that occurred. He claimed that the Shoah is not God's fault, but the result of man's choice to choose evil over good. And that could be your big claim as you start moving into your response. And we'll have a look at that when we look at sample responses. All right, but continuing Hester Panim, we just want to have a look here at the idea that Berkovitz put forward, that interhuman understanding based on the notion of dignity. And remember that if you're doing if you're looking at other areas of Judaism, you might have seen this word Tselem Elohim, which is the Jewish doctrine asserting that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, where we get from Genesis 1:27 and 26 as well. But I just thought I'd put in one quote there for you that you can link to this Tselem Elohim. It was a fundamental facet in Berkovitz's ideology. So the idea that humanity needed to understand other humans. And you see this in modern Orthodoxy, you have a lot more integration into society rather than that traditional Orthodoxy. So you now have this, you see this change in this religion, that in this dynamic living facet of Judaism. Berkovitz, he put forward the idea that a creator God, once again, linking back to the Shema. If we link back to the Shema, that idea of that creator, benevolent, single God, with man as a steward, which is a possible link for you guys to environmental ethics, if you want to link your Holocaust theology there, meant that humanity was charged with the duty of care for the world within human history. So that means not just the world, but people as a whole. And he stated through Genesis 2:15 that God's central concern was that humanity should take responsibility for history. But by that I mean, we were bad people when we did this. It more means being in charge of the situation as it's happening and taking responsibility and doing the right thing, if you will, by other humans. So improving the world and caring for it. Improving the world, once again, you can link to our study in year 11 of Tikkun Olam, the Jewish ethical teaching, sorry. Okay, Berkovitz sort of offered this, a defense of conventional notions of the covenant, really reinforcing that idea. In his book, Faith After the Holocaust, and you can see a quote there, that really the Holocaust was a reaction, or sorry, the blame of it was because of the human abuse of free will. Human beings ought to treat each other with respect and hold each other dear independently of theological dialogues. So you see there's the idea of an interfaith understanding. If you're moving back to that idea of interhuman understanding, you can link it to interfaith there and talk about that idea. I am duty bound to respect the dignity of every human being, no matter what. Dignity of every human being, linking back again to that idea, as we saw earlier, of Tselem Elohim. I apologize for my writing, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just writing flat, so it's difficult. No matter what I may think of his religion, mankind needs but interhuman understanding. That's he was saying that's the number one thing we need as a result of this. All right. If now we're looking at Emil Fakenheim and the 614th commandment. The 614th commandment, as you can see there, is thou shalt not grant Hitler posthumous victory. So it's quite a simple statement with a lot to unpack. Emil Fakenheim was a Reformed Jewish adherent. So now you see not only a difference in Jewish adherents coming up with ideas in terms of variants, but intervariant ideas. So within Reformed Judaism, you had Rubinstein who's saying the death of God, and you're saying Fakenheim and you've got Fakenheim saying that no, God's given us a new revelation, which is the 614th commandment, and it focused on the propagation of the Jewish people, the moving forward, the expansion of the Jewish people. And while this statement does seem simple, there's a lot to unpack, as I was saying. He believed that God had given the Jewish people this new 614th mitzvah. And by this, he meant that Jews must survive as Jews. Basically, it could be looked as a re-emphasis on the Pru Urvu. This word Pru Urvu refers to what some people would call the first commandment, which is, or the first mitzvah, to be fruitful and multiply, that God says to man in Genesis 1:28. So we saw that in Genesis 1:27, he makes man. And the very first thing he says to them in the very next verse is be fruitful and multiply. And this is known as the Pru Urvu. So you can link that to Jewish marriage. You see, I hope you're starting to see these links in your depth study that you can make. I just link to Jewish marriage. All right. I'm going for time. Still got a bit of time. Good. And so it's really about keeping the culture, the religion alive. And he saw that staying faithful to the ideals of the Shema, that omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God was realizing the promise of triumph over the adversity faced during the Shoah. It was necessary for the people to stay close to that ideal. He called for people not to despair of the world, because as is understandable, in the face of such an event, it's very easy to lose faith in whatever you believed in. But his call and his advocacy, was to not despair, but rather keep hope in God being always present. And you can link that back to your preliminary study of the omnipresence of God, and then that his creation was good. Where do we see that his creation was good? We see that in that repetition of God saw it was good in Genesis. And that's linking back again to that belief in a creator God. This meant that the covenant should still be held at the forefront of Jewish beliefs. Now, this is really an interesting paradigm by Fakenheim, because Fakenheim is a Reformed Jew. So not all Reformed Jewish adherents are really centralize themselves on the covenant and the halakha. They see it as a set of rules that can guide their life. Instead, Fakenheim was quite close to the covenant. he argued that both the Jewish believer and the Jewish agnostic could, to some extent, hear the voice of the leader. This word that they use in Hebrew is in this red box here, the metzavah, which means and had an obligation to unity. So now he's talking about the extreme need for Judaism as a whole to stay united. And that doesn't mean Orthodox need to become Reform or Reform need to become Orthodox or conservative. No, what it means is that as a people, they need to move forward together. And like he said, he saw that Reformation was impossible, but he championed the coming together of ideologies. And this quote here, the reason I put this quote in is because I love it. I think it's really, really strong. And a really good, bits of it are really good to be used if you're using this idea of Fakenheim, talking about unity within Judaism and the propagation of the Jewish people. He says, I think the authentic Jew of today is beginning to hear the 614th commandment, and he hears it whether as agnostic or believer. So whether they are fully practicing their religion or whether they've sort of become this cultural, less religious Jewish adherent. And we'll have a look at the demography of Judaism very soon. But he hears at the voice of the metzavah, the commander or the leader, in the commandment, in this 614th commandment. And moreover, it may well be the case that the authentic Jewish agnostic and the authentic Jewish believer are closer today than at any previous time. We'll have a brief look at this idea of the Haskalah very soon, but the Haskalah was the Jewish Enlightenment, and in the mid to late 1800s, there was a big split in the sort of ideology of Judaism in terms of the agnostic Jewish person and the completely religious Jewish person. And so he's saying that post Shoah, there is this coming together of ideology and this possibility of coming together. All right, let's have a look at our last bit of 614th commandment. He found solace in the Kabbalistic or the mystic. The mystic Judaism and that paradigm of Tikkun Olam, as we spoke about earlier in the prophetic vision. He related small acts of courage and charity in the camps. We're talking about Auschwitz, which often in Judaism, after Auschwitz, or Auschwitz is the other name for that time of the Shoah. And he likened them to shards of goodness and justice. And what's interesting in this idea of shards is that we remember that Tikkun Olam is this notion of a broken world, often symbolized by this idea of shattered. So he links back to this idea that within the shattering of a world, there are little bits of goodness. And this reaffirms this seemingly absent God that we sort of heard about, first of all, in this extreme measure in Rubinstein, and then this less extreme version when you're looking at the Hester Panim through Berkovitz. So you see that you've got these three completely different ideologies coming through. These are just three of many. Through human will, really, man could restore this broken world through these little acts that happen. And he urged people to continue to believe despite the outrage of the Shoah. And he really reaffirmed this presence of God in human history. He said here in this blue box, God is always present in Jewish history, even at Auschwitz. Humans cannot understand what he was doing at Auschwitz. So it's beyond our understanding. Often when we look at the supernatural, we see that humanity can't understand the supernatural. And this was Fakenheim's assertion. We don't know why, he was saying, we don't know why God allowed it, but we must insist that he was there. So that consistent insistence that God was present in that moment, maybe it was to let humanity work its free will. Maybe it was to bring Judaism into a new time, as with the other Hurbans, those destructions of the temple that changed Judaism. What we want to look at now is preliminary ideas about the impact. So now we're looking at impacts. This second second syllabus dot point, looking at the effects really. And when thinking about the Holocaust and subsequently Holocaust theology and how it's impacted Judaism, what we need to look at is the evidence given to us a little bit by academic sources. And we have this survey from 2018, which is the Australian Jewish Community Survey by Monash University. And this was a wide-reaching study in Victoria, really showing what had happened, or what I took this one specific table out, figure 4 out of this whole massive paper. You can Google it, guys, if you want to. That's the title just here. And figure 4 is looking at how important or unimportant each of the following is to a Jewish person's sense of identity. Okay, now we're looking, and if you look at number 1, 95%, the number one thing that Jewish adherents in Australia that was surveyed said is remembering the Holocaust. You know, you've then got upholding strong moral and ethical behavior. And as we go down, you see that prayer, believing in God, is in the lower section. So we've seen a change in the demography of Judaism already before we even look at that sort of stuff. Observing the Holocaust comes in 34%. What was once central to Jewish life, the study of Jewish religious texts, is at 31%. And this study was done over 8,000 people, but it was done across a range of ages. I hope you go and have a look at this document, because it really gives you this snapshot of that when you look at it like that. However, if you do want to make more links to other sections, you've still got marriage there, supporting social justice issues, which can link to pardon me, I'm just having a mind blank, which can link to environmental ethics. Sorry, it's just been a long day, guys. But you see another really important one at 87 is belonging to a Jewish community. So the idea of unity is still present. So Fakenheim's idea. We can see that Fakenheim really comes to fruition in these two ideas, in that and that. Okay, but if that wasn't enough for us and we say, oh, well, that's just Australia, the Pew Research, looking at the US, has remembering the Holocaust at number 1 as well. So we see that realistically, morality again, and is up there, but the Holocaust is fundamental to the identity of Judaism today. You know, we're not just, this is not just a one-off study. That these studies have been done where hubs of Jewish adherents are present, and this is always this prevailing idea that Judaism must remember the Holocaust. It's fundamental to their identity, sorry. And so now let's have a look at Holocaust theology as we move on at the impact. So one major impact was, as we said, towards the views of the covenant. Okay, we can see that the concept really being put forward here. I've brought in another theologian who was a contemporary of Rubinstein, so you can link that into your talk about this death of God, because Irving Greenberg conceptualized that in a new way. He spoke of the broken covenant. You know, he said that as a result of God's lack of intervention in that moment during the Shoah, adherents could voluntarily enter the covenant based on how they felt. You know, so this, rather than being a chosen people that God has decided to hold to the covenant, the adherent now was the person that choice. And it's funny because this broken covenant idea and Greenberg's assertion really actually links into what Berkovitz was saying about man's free will. You know, you could contextualize that and link that idea of free will to this broken covenant and the choice of covenant, right? And there was a fair bit of rebuttal to that in the Orthodox Jewish strands, which said, you know, Orthodox Jews saw that God was not responsible for the actions of men during the Holocaust, and many Haredi Jews, which are an Orthodox group, who are quite strictly adherent to the Halakha, sought to strengthen Judaism observance of the covenant. So we had these two ideologies really that rebutted, that came to butt heads as a result of the Holocaust. This idea of strengthening the covenant, or Greenberg and Rubenstein's idea that the covenant was now under the jurisdiction of man. Because if we remember that in the Torah, the covenant is made between man and God, but it's always God that goes through the covenant. He, like with Abraham is paralyzed as God goes through the burnt offering, and the same once again in Mount Sinai with Moses and the people of Israel. So Emil Fakenheim 614th Commandment saw an increased acceptance of Zionism and Israel as the promised land of God's chosen people, spoken about in the Torah. But what's really important to note in this section, and I always want people to remember when you're talking about this, during the Haskalah or the Jewish Enlightenment, that period in the late 1800s was when Zionism really saw a rise. Okay, and so what I want you to understand is that this isn't the main thing you want to be talking about. While you can mention it, that's not the fundamental main argument we take out of Fakenheim. It was about the solidarity of the Jewish people moving forward as a people. Okay, you can see that this is in the times of Israel, taken sort of a snapshot of the demography of Israel today, and so many ultra-Orthodox adherents sort of opposed the concept of a Jewish nation states as it contradicted the coming of a Messianic age. And you see that Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox actually the smallest demography in Judaism in Israel, and it was mainly secular and traditional, but Reform and conservative Jewish group variants are more present in Israel. These sentiments are reflected, as I said, by the smaller percentages of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox adherents residing in Israel today. The impacts, we're still moving on here, and this is central, guys, central to our belief, our idea of Holocaust theology is zakor, the Hebrew term for remember that is often used for the remembrance of the Shoah. So this is an important part of terminology that you can use. The various arguments that have come out of the Holocaust, and when I say arguments, I mean the different ideologies and ideas that have come out in various streams of Judaism, have many different stances and on the living the religion of within modern society. And a central concept, a really important idea that the vast majority of Jewish adherents, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, they all agree on, as we saw in our statistics, is that idea of remembering the Holocaust and the martyrs who lost their lives. This term martyrs is a term that they use vociferously in their rhetoric. And Jewish adherents as a whole see it as a mandate. And now this idea of mandate can link back to this 614th commandment again, to not allow despair to shut their testimonies forever. Memory and writing is at the heart of what it means to be a Jewish adherent, and the Holocaust is a temptation to hopelessness, which is something that Jewish religious adherents are called to hope against all this suffering. And this idea is completely discredited by the Shoah. As we move on, we see Fakenheim's 614th commandment has led to the initiation of the Yom HaShoah, very important example that we can use, dedicated to preserving the memory of those who have lost their lives during the genocide and honoring those who fought against their Nazi oppressors. And this Yom HaShoah literally means day of remembrance for the victims of the Holocaust. And contemporary examples of Jewish witness can be found, as I said at the beginning of this, locally in the Sydney Jewish Museum in Surrey Hills. But a really good international perspective was from a very great man, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his 2020 International Holocaust Memorial Day address. He said, "The sages said that every life is like a universe, and we as a people lost 6 million universes during the Shoah," he's obviously meaning. "Humanity as a whole lost in the 20th century over 100 million universes as a result of man's brutality against man. Every one of us counts." And he's really linking back to this concept of Elam Elohim and the importance of upholding human dignity. So what you can build from there is this idea that Judaism today sees paramount the need for humanity to affirm the humanity of other people in Judaism and in fact outside of Judaism as well. We can see demography shifts, right? So the concept of dead God led many to question whether the covenant and that eternal contract had really expired by this point. It's important, really important to note that we're not just talking about the dead God as being the be-all, end-all that started this demographic shift, my apologies. But really, it started in the late 1800s and was reinforced by Rubinstein's idea. But between the two, it led to a shift in less orthodox variants of Judaism. And we can see that statistically reflected in our US Jewish adherence table that we've got there. Ultimately, the concept of secular Judaism became more prominent than it had in the past. With a break from the covenant, many Jewish people continued to uphold those ethno-cultural ideals of Judaism. So the Shabbat was still important, right? The high holidays were still important, but only in the sense of that cultural ideology rather than the religious. Okay. Now, another big impact was on the philanthropy and the changing relationships with society. Berkowitz's idea of Hester Panim affirmed the principle of belief of an omnipresent and omniscient God, omnipotent, and his argument of man's free will, seen in Genesis 2:16, supported that man had a moral failure throughout the Holocaust, and as a result, you could emphasize this idea of tzedak, or Jewish charity, charge adherents to be good and impact the world philanthropically. This idea had been can refer to ideas like tikkun olam. You can find examples of Australian Jew James Spiegelman, who's related to Art Spiegelman, if anyone's ever read Mouse. And he had big parts in the humanitarian rights, in the freedom rides in 1965, which focused on the human rights of Indigenous Australians. So you have a human example there, a very, very close to home example of a Jewish adherent that took this idea of taking this need for Jewish engagement with society to the next level. And one aspect of insularity, which was seen as important in Judaism, is this idea of marriage, still pushing forward in the 614th commandment, which you can once again link to the Pru Urvu, which is that first commandment from Genesis 1:28. Okay, now quickly, let's have a look at a response from a previous HSC question. I think, pardon me, I misplaced my notes for this, but I think it was in, this was the 2016 8-mark response in section 2 for Judaism. And the stimulus here is, I command you today to love the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Now, we've only got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly. But you see that our verb there is how, which generally links to explain. Which looks at cause and effect, right? Or demonstrating a relationship. So how is one significant personal school of thought? In this one, we're talking about Holocaust theology. So how has Holocaust theology encouraged adherents to follow the command to love the Lord your God and to walk in his ways? Okay. So we have several ideas that we can talk about from previously up there, but what I've got a response here that we're going to go through quickly, and I'll read it out and then I'll show you how I've responded and how I've linked to these things. So as a marker in the HSC, we're looking to, is the person responding to the question? Are they consistently using the stimulus? Are they incorporating terminology and quotes? And are they providing content that links to that? Okay, so let's have a look. The various responses of Jewish adherents which have contributed to the Holocaust theology have continued to encourage adherents to love God and walk in his ways by remaining faithful to him. Theologians such as Eliezer Berkovitz, Ignaz Maybaum, and Emil Fakenheim have all contributed to discussions among Jewish theologians attempting to provide answers to the questions posed about God as a result of the atrocities faced by the Jewish people during the Shoah. Okay, so in that first part, the student has just answered the question. They've given me a couple of ideas, but they've only really talked to me about the contributors. Now we'll see that they go into the contributions. Berkovitz, a modern Orthodox Jewish rabbi, put forward the notion that God was not at fault for the Holocaust by integrating into a modern context the concept of Hester Panim taken from Deuteronomy, where God hid his face from the Israelites. He asserted that man was at fault for the Holocaust as the principle of free will demands God refrain from intervention. So we're looking at a lot of ideas here. And then he links in the doctrine of Telem Elohim, sets up man as a steward of the world, a notion furthered by his book, Faith in the Holocaust, which stresses the fault of man in abusing the gift of his free will. He's talking about how people use their free will to hurt others during the Holocaust. This notion encourages Jews to love the Lord, realizing that God was not at fault for the atrocities. Ignaz Maybaum, a leading Jewish theologian in the 20th century, argued that the Shoah was the third Hurban, which we spoke about earlier. In the previous two Hurban, Judaism developed and flourished. Thus, Jews are called to stay close to the covenant through adhering to the halakha and walking in God's ways. Maybaum recontextualized the notion of Isaiah's suffering servant in Isaiah 53 through the context of vicarious suffering, stating in Auschwitz, Jews suffered vicarious atonement for the sins of mankind. So he was saying, Jewish people suffered for others as in Auschwitz. And this allowed Jews to walk in his ways by loving mankind through their actions. So, and then additionally, Fakenheim proposed that the Holocaust was a new revelation. We talk about the 614th mitzvot there. Now shall not grant Hitler posthumous victory. With the new commandment, adherents are encouraged to strive towards the continuation of the Jewish tradition. This manifested in a re-emphasis of the Pro Urvu, or the first commandment, found in Genesis 1:28, telling people to be fruitful and multiply. Ultimately, this underlines the importance of Jewish marriage as a means to continue the faith of the people. And then finally, we have just that little closing statement. Ultimately, the diverse notions proposed by the various contributors of Holocaust theology has aided adherents in continuing to love the Lord and walk in his ways by providing reasons for the occurrence of the tragedy and encouraging them to remember their faith. So if we go back all the way to the start and we said those big questions, why would God allow this? If we're talking about dynamic and living, you can see there, providing reasons. Okay, so let's have a look. Here in the yellow is that responding to the question, that consistently linking back to the idea of, the notion by loving man. This allowed is showing that idea of, encourages, is that idea of showing a relationship. This thing allows something else to happen or encourages something else to happen. Underlines the importance, really brings out the idea that Jewish people are seeing this as an event, an important event. Has the stimulus been used? You can see consistently throughout, the stimulus is scattered there. So the marker is seeing that this person is integrating this into their response, not just throwing the whole statement. If we move on to our next section, you see that there's a lot of terminology used. You've got the Shoah, you've got Hester Panim, even things like modern Orthodox, you're using the variants, Selem Elohim, but then also we've got quotes. Genesis 1:28, be fruitful, multiply. They shall not grant Hitler posthumous victory. Isaiah 53, Deuteronomy 3:17, in Hester Panim. We're moving through. We're not only giving terminology, but we're giving quotes, and we're using quotes outside of the context of just the scriptures. And then finally, are we providing content? We're providing that idea of Berkowitz, Maybaum, and Fakenheim. Sorry, guys, I think we've gone pretty long. Apologies for taking so long, but if there aren't any questions, remember that all of this is available on the link where you got it from. And thank you for your participation today. I hope you got something out of this. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I know we had a lot to get through and there was a lot of information overload, but I really appreciate your time. Thanks, guys.